What if I told you that $100 super-sensitive high-modulus carbon ice fishing rod you bought is actually the #1 reason you're not feeling bites? It sounds crazy, right? We've all been taught that stiffness equals sensitivity, that a rigid backbone transmits every single tap and tick straight to your hand. But today we're going to expose a hard truth. We're going to show you how that prized rod might be completely numb to the most common bites you'll encounter on the ice. Stick around, because what you learn today could completely change how you fish this winter. So let me ask you this right now. Do you believe a softer rod can be more sensitive than a stiff one? Let me know in the comments, and let's see if I can change your mind. For years, the fishing industry has sold us on one idea: technology. High-modulus graphite, carbon fiber, titanium guides, all promising to help us feel the lightest bite from 100 feet down. We've become a generation of fishermen obsessed with feel. We equate a stiff, fast-action rod with performance, like a sports car with stiff suspension. The old whippy fiberglass rods our grandfathers used, we see those as outdated, cheap, and numb. This belief is so ingrained that we spend hundreds of dollars chasing that tap, convinced it's the only way. But we've forgotten something fundamental about how fish, especially finicky panfish in cold water, actually eat. We've been so focused on feeling the bite, we've forgotten how to see it. Let's start with the core belief we all share. The idea is that a stiff rod acts like a telephone line. A fish bumps the lure, that vibration travels up the line, through the stiff rod blank, and into your hand. It makes perfect sense in theory. A rigid material should transmit energy better than a soft, absorbent one. And for certain types of aggressive bites, like a walleye slamming a jigging wrap, this is absolutely true. You feel a solid thump, you set the hook, and the fish is on. The industry built its entire marketing strategy around this single, aggressive bite scenario. But how often does that actually happen, especially when you're chasing perch or crappie? Now let's change the scene. Imagine you're out on a cold front day. The barometric pressure is high, the sky is clear, and the fish are notoriously fussy. You're using a tiny tungsten jig tipped with a wax worm. A perch swims up to your bait. It doesn't slam it, it just inhales it. The fish flares its gills, sucks the jig into its mouth, and just sits there, suspended in the water column. There was no tick. There was no thump. The only thing that changed was a tiny amount of weight being added to the end of your line. Your super stiff, high-tech rod doesn't even register this. It's designed for impact, not for a subtle change in pressure. This brings us to the great deception: tactile sensitivity versus visual sensitivity. Your hand, connected to a stiff rod, is great at feeling vibrations and impacts. That's tactile. But your eyes are far better at detecting subtle changes in movement. That's visual. A stiff rod prioritizes what you feel, often at the complete expense of what you can see. When a fish just barely lifts your jig, the stiff rod blank doesn't have enough give to bend or unbend. It absorbs that tiny change. The tip barely moves. You feel nothing, you see nothing, and a few seconds later, the fish spits the hook and you never even knew it was there. Let's talk about the material itself. High-modulus carbon is incredibly rigid and has a very fast recovery rate. Think about it like tapping a steel pipe versus a rubber hose. Pipe rings, the hose just goes thud. That's why carbon is great for transmitting sharp taps. But it's also its greatest weakness. Because it's so resistant to bending, it acts as a dampener for non-aggressive bites. It essentially filters out the subtle information. It's like trying to weigh a single feather on a truck scale. The scale is built for heavy loads, and the feather's weight is too insignificant to even make the needle quiver. Your stiff rod is that truck scale. Now let's dive into the most missed bite in all of winter fishing, the up bite. And this is especially common with crappie and bluegill. The fish swims up from below your lure and sucks it in, continuing to swim upward for a foot or two. What happens to your line? It goes slack. Your jig, which was pulling down on your rod tip, suddenly becomes weightless. On a stiff carbon rod, what happens? Almost nothing. The tip might rise a millimeter. You won't feel a thing because there's no downward pull to transmit. The rod's stiffness fights against this change, masking it completely. You just think the fish are gone. Let's put this into a visual you can imagine right now. Picture your stiff carbon rod held out over a hole. The jig is pulling the tip down just a little bit. Now, an up bite happens. The line goes slack. That rod tip, because it's so rigid and wants to stay straight, barely moves. It might straighten out a tiny fraction of an inch, a movement so small your cold eyes will never see it. It offers no visual cue. You are, for all intents and purposes, completely blind to that bite. The fish has your bait, and you are none the wiser. It's the perfect crime. Okay, now let's swap out that expensive rod for a soft, cheap fiberglass noodle rod, or even just a rod with a very soft tip. We drop the same jig down. The weight of the jig puts a deep, noticeable curve into that soft tip. The rod is loaded. Now, that same crappie swims up and inhales the bait. The line goes slack. What does that soft tip do? It doesn't stay rigid. It instantly springs upward, straightening out. That deep curve is suddenly gone. The movement isn't a millimeter. It's a full inch or more. You can't miss it. You didn't feel a thing, but you saw everything. This is the secret. A softer rod acts as a visual indicator of weight change. It's not about feeling a tick. It's about seeing the rod load and unload. When a fish takes the weight of the jig, the rod tip dips. When a fish lifts the jig, the rod tip rises. It's a perfect, simple, visual system. Your eyes are now your primary bite detectors, and they are far more sensitive to this kind of movement than your cold fingers will ever be. You've switched from trying to hear a whisper in a loud room to watching a bright light flash in the dark. Let's consider another common scenario, what I call the mushy bite. This is when a fish, like a perch, just kind of swims up and mouths the lure. Doesn't hit it hard, it just holds it. On your stiff rod, you'll lift up to jig again and you'll feel a slight mushy weight. Your first instinct is that you've snagged a weed or some gunk on the bottom. Why? Because the rod doesn't give. There's no confirmation. It's just a dead weight. So you shake the rod to clear the weed, and you end up pulling the lure right out of the fish's mouth. Now let's replay that mushy bite with a softer rod. The perch mouths the lure. The soft tip, which was already bent from the lure's weight, just dips down a little further. It doesn't feel like a weed, it feels heavy. The rod's bend confirms that something with weight has been added to the system. It telegraphs the information visually. You see the tip load up, you lift, and instead of a dead weight, you feel the head shakes. You've just converted a bite you would have dismissed as a snag into a fish on the ice. It's a complete game changer. Some of you might be thinking, well, that's what a spring bobber is for. And you're right, but think about what a spring bobber really is. It's a super flexible, soft tip that you add onto your ultra-stiff, insensitive rod. You're literally buying an accessory to fix a problem your expensive rod created in the first place. You've paid a premium for a stiff blank only to bypass it with a spring. It proves the point. For detecting light bites, you need that visual flex. Why not just use a rod that has that flex built right into the tip? This brings us to the unsung hero of light bite detection, fiberglass. Yes, that cheap, old-school material. Fiberglass has a much slower, more parabolic action. It bends more easily and more deeply. It's not as sensitive in the traditional tactile sense. You won't feel every pebble your jig scrapes against. But what it lacks in feel, it makes up for tenfold in sight. It is the ultimate visual bite detection tool. It perfectly loads and unloads with the slightest change in tension, screaming "fish on" to your eyes long before your hand would ever get the message. I remember a specific day a few years ago. I was on a lake known for tough perch fishing. I had my fancy $150 carbon setup, and for 2 hours, nothing. My buddy, sitting 20 feet away, was using a $10 bright orange kiddie fiberglass rod, and he was hammering them. I was frustrated. I finally walked over and just watched his rod tip. On a lift, it would stay bent. Then it would just dip, a tiny extra little dip. He'd set the hook and land another perch. He wasn't feeling a thing. He was just watching the rod load. That day, I went home and dug out an old soft-tipped rod I had. The next day, I went back to the same spot. I stopped trying to feel the bite. Instead, I just jigged, paused, and watched that tip with intense focus. I trained my eyes to see the moment it dipped just a little extra, or the moment it rose up just a bit. It felt strange at first, but then it started working. Fish after fish came up the hole. I was detecting bites that were completely imperceptible on my better rod. I had been fishing blind for years. So, does this mean your expensive carbon fiber rod is garbage? Not at all. It just means it's a specialized tool, not a do-it-all solution. If you're fishing for aggressive walleye with a heavy spoon or targeting lake trout in deep water, that stiffness is your best friend. You need that power for a solid hook set and to feel that hard, unmistakable thump. But for 90% of pan-fishing situations where the bites are light and tentative, it's simply the wrong tool for the job. It's like using a sledgehammer to tap in a thumbtack. The key is to match your equipment to the fish's behavior. Are you expecting fish to crush your lure? Go with the stiff rod. Are you on a tough bite, fishing for finicky crappie or perch that are just mouthing the bait? You absolutely need a rod with a soft, visual tip. It's not about which rod is best, it's about which rod is right for that specific day and that specific species. The smart angler has both in their sled and isn't afraid to switch when one isn't working. Remember, the most sensitive thing connecting you to the fish is your line. The rod is just the interface. Its job is to translate what the line is doing into information you can understand. A stiff rod tries to translate it into a feeling for your hand. A soft rod translates it into a movement for your eye. In the cold, with numb fingers and subtle bites, your eyes are simply a more reliable receiver of that information. Don't let your expensive rod get in the way and filter out the message. Here's a simple experiment you can do right in your garage. Take a stiff graphite rod or even just a wooden dowel or pencil. Tie a short piece of string to the end with a small weight, like a single key. Now have a friend gently and slowly lift the key just a tiny bit. The pencil barely moves. You feel almost nothing. Now do the same thing with something very flexible, like a soft-tipped rod or even a rubber ruler. When your friend lifts the key, the end of the ruler springs up dramatically. The visual difference is undeniable. So the final verdict is this: stop chasing the feel. Start watching for changes in weight. The fishing industry sold you a sports car when what you really needed for these tough winter backroads was a truck with soft suspension. That ultra-responsive, sensitive rod is so stiff that it rides right over the top of subtle bumps, jars and dips. It smooths everything out, leaving you numb to what's really happening down below. The ugly truth is your best rod might be your worst enemy. The next time you head out, I challenge you to do something. Bring that old, cheap fiberglass rod with you. Or if you don't have one, pick up one of those inexpensive ice fishing combos for 10 or 15 bucks. Rig it up and use it for an hour. Don't try to feel anything, just watch that tip like a hawk. Watch for it to dip, watch for it to rise. I promise you, you will detect bites you never knew you were missing. It will feel awkward at first, but it just might be the single biggest thing you can do to improve your winter catch rate. So let's wrap this up. The biggest aha moment here is realizing that the pursuit of tactile sensitivity, the very thing we've been told to value most, might be the exact reason our catch rates have suffered. The most expensive rod isn't always the best rod. The real twist is that the solution isn't in buying more advanced gear, but in going back to a simpler, more visual approach. It's about understanding that for finicky fish, a rod that shows the bite is infinitely better than one that's supposed to feel the bite. This simple shift in mindset from feeling to seeing can fundamentally change your success on the ice. Thank you so much for watching. If this video challenged your way of thinking, hit that like button and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next myth-busting video. Now I want to hear from you. What's the biggest fishing myth or piece of common wisdom that you discovered was completely wrong? Share your story in the comments below. I read every single one.